Welcome everyone. I am Ingrid Honkala. I am a Spiritual Awakenings International board member and board member of the Spanish Committee and a PSI affiliate group leader. Welcome to Spiritual Awakenings International Conference 2023 Spiritual Emergency Panel. So today we're going to start with our first speaker. His name is Sean Blackwell. And Sean has been researching and teaching about the spiritual dimension and healing potential of bipolar disorder since 2007 through his YouTube channel called Bipolar Awakenings. His book, Am I Bipolar or Waking Up?, describes his own bipolar awakening, subsequent hospitalizations, and complete recovery, which happened in 1996. So here I leave you with Sean.
Okay, great. So today I'm going to be talking about the spiritual dimension of bipolar disorder, as well as its healing potential. All right. And just so you know, I've been at this for a while. I started talking about the spiritual dimension of actually what I thought of as my spiritual emergency on YouTube in 2007. And I was asking people the question of, am I bipolar or waking up? I knew I had a spiritual awakening experience, but I wanted to hear from people who had the diagnosis of bipolar disorder about, what their processes were like. Okay. And that's when my work on my YouTube channel at the time was called Bipolar or Waking Up, and now it's called Bipolar Awakenings. Right. So it's been a long journey. And I published my book, Am I Bipolar Waking Up, in 2011, tells my story. And before we get into, the spiritual dimension of bipolar, it's important to have a bit of a fact check that can sort of break people's brains to a certain degree, all right? And the first fact is that there is no scientific evidence that bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or actually any mental illness in the DSM is genetic. That's the diagnostic manual for psychiatrists, okay? They don't have any scientific evidence for that. And that's coming out into the forefront now. In 2022, Dr. Joanna Moncrief, she published a widely publicized piece of research on the chemical imbalance theory. Everybody's heard that chemical imbalances cause depression. Actually, there's no evidence for that whatsoever. And the truth is, there's no evidence of chemical imbalances causing any mental disorder. Okay, it's all a myth from psychiatry. Okay, not to say that psychiatry isn't helpful sometimes, but that story is just a myth that's been perpetuated for decades. Right. So, but at the same time, even though it's not genetic, almost everybody thinks of like a spiritual awakening or a spiritual emergency like I had that got me hospitalized as a challenging blessing. If people are familiar with the term, they understand it as, well, it's a spiritual experience. Might have been difficult, but it was still spiritual and can lead to a breakthrough like I had, right? And then they see bipolar disorder as like a mental illness. So these two things are quite separate from each other. And schizophrenia as more of a severe mental illness, all right? Although most people really don't know the difference, okay? So we're going to take a look at the difference. And the first thing, though, is to understand that the term acute psychosis, which can mean like a complete break from reality where you really can't function, you're delusional, you're really behaving strangely, is usually diagnosed by psychiatry as bipolar disorder 1. They sort of describe it as hypomania, where you sort of have a high energy level going into this psychosis, a break with reality. And if that repeats for you, you get that diagnosis, bipolar disorder 1, in most countries. Decades ago, however, and still in some psychological manuals and journals and things like that, they'll refer to anyone with acute psychosis as having schizophrenia. All right. So there's a bit of confusion there, even in professional circles. And then for transpersonal psychology, there's also this spiritual awakening that's difficult. We can call it a spiritual emergency. Isabel Clarke calls it a spiritually transformative experience, right? But they could all be considered acute psychosis. That's the strange part by psychiatry. So I've got a little quiz for you. You can think about this at home. Of course, I don't need anybody to speak up, but I'm going to list some symptoms here, so-called symptoms, and you think to yourself, would this be part of bipolar disorder or a spiritual emergency? Ecstatic mood, feeling of oneness, a sense of newly gained knowledge, heightened senses. Well, certainly these are spiritual, so-called spiritual symptoms, you might say. Could be part of a spiritual awakening, a spiritual emergency. But many people who are diagnosed with bipolar disorder and medicated for life have these symptoms as well. Okay, it's very common. How about these delusions that you've become a messiah, or that you're giving birth to a messiah, that you've had encounters with angels or devils, that you were caught between the forces of good and evil, that you had magical powers, like telepathy, for example, or psychic thoughts, or that you're on a special mission or journey. Obviously, these delusions have strong spiritual implications, and a lot of people with spiritual emergency have these experiences. I know I did. But people with bipolar disorder, medicated for life, have all of these too. Okay. Now, what about this group? Fighting with people around you, arguing with people around you, paranoid thoughts, threatening visual hallucinations, disturbing audible hallucinations, suicidal thoughts. Well, obviously, this group of symptoms can be thought of as maybe more of a mental illness and more common like that. But when you have spiritual emergency, sometimes these thoughts can come up too. Okay, so how do we make a distinction between these categories? Well, the first thing to understand, and this comes from talking to people online for 15 years, is that there is no clear differentiation between schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and spiritual emergency. And I think in the world of transpersonal psychology, there's been a lot of energy put into the distinction, like, well, that's a spiritual experience, not a mental illness. The truth is, it's not really like that, okay? But what you do have is a gradient of experience, okay? And on one end of this gradient, one end of this spectrum, you'll have experiences that are have more disturbing content. The process is more externalized. People think of it as something that's happening to them. It's more fearful. It's potentially more violent. And the understandings are more concrete, okay? I'll talk about that in a second. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the non-ordinary state experience, of the spiritual awakening that gets sort of considered difficult, a spiritual emergency, blissful content, but people understand that something's going on within them. It's an internalized process. It's more loving, tends to be non-violent, and the understandings are more symbolic. So for example, if you think of yourself as the Messiah, you might see yourself as some sort of Messiah figure representing a divine energy inside yourself. You can kind of have that loose interpretation, whereas the concrete understanding would be like, I'm Jesus, everybody needs to worship me. And then with bipolar disorder, what you get is a mix of this content, usually. Very disturbing content mixed with blissful content. Externalized experiences mixed with an internalized experience. Fearful and loving. And sometimes one flipping to the other, like very quickly. Okay, so what's the source of this divergence? Okay, because it seems like there's no way to differentiate mental illness from spiritual experience. So how do you look at this? How do you make sense of this change in experience from one end of the spectrum to the other? Well, another fact check for you here. Trauma causes mental disorders. It's as simple as that. The meta studies have been published about that. It's very clear. And one particular doctor, John Reed, has really dedicated his life to promoting that possibility. He's published a lot of research. And in a recent interview, he has said, child physical and sexual abuse are incredibly predictive of psychosis. Okay, and that would go for a lot of other factors and much more than any genetic factor. That's something he also said. So one important factor to look at is how traumatized a person has been. And some people are much more traumatized than others. High levels of trauma might include, for example, repeated sexual abuse, especially before the age of 10. Imagine that, having multiple adults having sex with you before you're 10 years old. I mean, that's as most traumatic a situation as I can imagine. And it happens, unfortunately. Mid-level trauma might be high school bullying, repeated bullying, and then maybe a less traumatic experience might be emotional repression. Okay, just to give a few tangible ideas. So that's one access for our understanding of the divergence between, very disturbing schizophrenia and a difficult but spiritual experience. Okay. The other criteria is one's maturity. And if anyone's familiar with the work of Ken Wilber or spiral dynamics, you could also refer to it as the evolution of consciousness. And some people have a lower level of consciousness and some people have a higher level of consciousness. Okay, it's just And what you'll have is a relationship here as well, so that people who are highly traumatized tend to be less mature. So for example, if you had a 30-year-old man who is highly traumatized, chances are that he is going to have a lower level of maturity or evolution of consciousness than a person who has had less trauma in their lives, who will have a higher level of consciousness, okay? So you've got a direct relationship there. And for people who are familiar with that work of spiral dynamics and Ken Wilber, we can look at certain criteria to tell where a person is in the maturity. And the most basic way to look at it is that when people lack maturity, they're more selfish and they're more impulsive. You know, they're just trying to get their immediate sensory needs met, and they don't care about the implications for other people. As we develop, we become more rational, sort of a modern state of mind. And then as we really develop, we become postmodern, more diverse in our thinking, multiple perspective people, you know, people who can see things from multiple perspectives, and intuitive, okay, where you can see the whole development, all right? So, you know, entire books have been written on this evolution of consciousness, but just so you know, to keep it simple, lower level of consciousness people are more selfish and impulsive than higher level of conscious people, all right? Now, here's where things get interesting. Because when people are at a lower level of maturity or of consciousness, the world they see is more externalized. When problems happen for them, they tend to blame others. They're more fearful in their approach to life. They are more violent, and they interpret things in a more concrete way. When people are more mature, they see the role of themselves in their issues. They're more internalized, they're more loving, they're nonviolent, and they see things in a more symbolic way. Now, does that sound familiar? Well, it should, because that's also how people interpret things when they go into non-ordinary states, with the more externalized, fearful, violent being associated with the more disturbing content, okay, and vice versa. Okay, so now what's interesting is, in talking to people over those 15 years, what I found is that when people are highly traumatized, and they have that lack maturity, lower level of consciousness, they tend to have a more disturbing psychosis, more concrete threatening hallucinations coming at them, more paranoia, all right? At the opposite end of the spectrum, when people have less trauma and are more developed, they have more blissful psychosis, feelings of oneness, feelings of connectedness, deeper understanding, meaning in life, wanting to save the world, this kind of thing, all right? Still gets hospitalized though, and still gets medicated, basically is the same thing. That's important to remember. And then the vast majority of people have a mixed episode, okay? A little bit of the disturbing, a little bit of the blissful, and back and forth they go. And they tend to be, you know, not so heavily traumatized, a little bit more mature. That's been my findings over, you know, the time I've been online talking to people. And then what happens as far as the diagnosis is that people with the disturbing content, very disturbing content, tend to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. If you see a transpersonal psychologist or someone with a spiritual orientation, they might identify a more benevolent, non-ordinary state as a spiritual emergency, although in psychiatry, they still look at that as probably bipolar disorder, you know, the typical acute psychosis. And then bipolar disorder, the mixed experience is in the middle, you know. Okay, so what are the implications for this model? Well, the first thing you got to understand is that, again, there's overlap here. So many people get multiple diagnoses, you know. They see one psychiatrist, they get a bipolar diagnosis, they talk a little more to another, they get a schizoaffective diagnosis, then maybe years down the road, it becomes schizophrenia. So there's really a fluidity between these experiences. I remember one guy who was in a clinic in California, and there were two psychiatrists with two different perspectives running this clinic. And one was insisting that the client was going through a spiritual emergency, and the other was insisting that he had bipolar disorder. And they were arguing over that. It was quite interesting. Okay. And also, it's important to understand that the probability of healing, being able to work through a process and get grounded again with minimal support, is going to be higher when you've had less trauma and you're a more mature person. It's going to be lower when you've had more trauma and you're a less mature person. Okay. And that's why when I work with people, because I'm a certified holotropic breathwork facilitator, and we'll talk about that. I run retreats for people who've been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, private retreats, one person at a time, right? But when I do those retreats, I am looking for people who are at sort of the upper right end of the spectrum, because I want their experience to be safe, and I want them to get a lot out of the experience. People in the lower end, the lower left-hand corner of this experience, they're going to have more difficulty trusting me. They might externalize difficult processes, and they might not get what they hope out of their investment. Okay, it's more likely they're going to have a good investment if they have less trauma in their lives and they're more developed. Okay, so what to make of this? You know, this completely different understanding of the relationship between mental illness and spiritual experience, because basically what I'm saying is this: it's time for a new paradigm. We need to start looking at mental disorders, mental illnesses in an entirely different way. The medical model sees us as chemicals and bones and meat, and of course that's all there, but we also have this spiritual dimension, right? This is the transpersonal model. The artwork is done by Alex Gray. And, you know, we all have this bioenergetic system going through us. You could call it a chakra system. You could call it a Kundalini system. But when we include the spiritual system into our understanding, it becomes easier to understand that bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, as well as spiritual emergency, are caused by emotional trauma. Everybody's got some level of emotional trauma. Trauma is held in blockages in our bioenergetic system. To heal a disorder, these blockages must be released. That's what we need to do. Simple as that. And so instead of researching and focusing on brain chemistry, we should be researching somatic healing practices to heal the body, okay, to help release these blockages. Because if you can release the blockages, you can heal these disorders, okay? My name is Sean Blackwell. My website is bipolarawakenings.com. And I do this sort of work on my private healing retreats. If anybody is interested, you could take a look at my website and get deeper details. Most of my work starts with a technique created by Stan Grof called holotropic breath work. Although holotropic breath work is not really designed for people with disorders, it's a little bit of a complex situation. So I've had to make modifications. I use a technique called bipolar breath work. And believe it or not, I actually do breath work on behalf of clients, which is entirely possible as well, which is a bit of a shocker. I tend to do distance work that way. Okay, so that's about it.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was very interesting and very informative. And now our next speaker will be Dr. Anne Berger-Nohr. Dr. Anne is an associate professor of education at Lebanon Valley College, a small liberal art college in central Pennsylvania, and has been teaching in higher education for the past 30 years. Specifically, she teaches literary courses and research courses in both undergrad and grad programs in teacher education. And I leave you with you, Anne.
So thank you for that introduction. Can you hear me okay, everybody?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So I'd like to thank you for coming today, and also thank the Spiritual Awakenings International Conference for the opportunity to speak with you. This is only the second time that I have shared my experience in a public forum. So I'm very excited, so thank you. For the past 2.5 years, I have researched my experience relentlessly in an attempt to understand it. When my spiritual emergency happened to me, I had no idea what occurred. In the process, I have researched many types of spiritual experiences and many things about them. While I don't consider myself to be an expert on everything per se, I do consider myself to be an expert on my own experience. And I'd like to share that with you today. Between the years of 2019 and 2022, I experienced 10 after-death communications with deceased family members. After-death communications can be defined as any contact between a living person and the consciousness, spirit, or soul of the so-called dead. 7 of my 10 ADCs were spontaneous, which means they happened without any warning, just suddenly. 4 of my 7 ADCs were spontaneous and shared with my younger daughter. My 3rd spontaneous ADC resulted in a profound mystical experience that catapulted me into a spiritual emergency or a psycho-spiritual crisis, which lasted for close to 2 years. This list here is my 10 after-death communications. The blue highlights show my spontaneous ADCs that were experienced only by me. And the green highlights there show the ADCs that were experienced with my younger daughter. And I had two after-death communications, 2 through a psychic medium to help me sort of understand the experiences that I was going through. I'm going to focus today on my spiritual awakening or my mystical experience. So this happened to me on October 27th of 2020, while I was on a sabbatical leave as a college professor. It's important to note that it was a highly reflective time for me, but I also had experienced 5 major life events or crises in my life in 2020 alone, COVID being one of them. In October, in a return trip home from Burlington, Vermont, having visited with my youngest daughter at college, I couldn't stop thinking about my sister and the anniversary of her death. My sister Lisa died on October 8th, 1983 of cardiomyopathy when I was 18 years old. She was 23. It occurred to me on my 8-hour drive home to Pennsylvania that this would be the first time in my life that I would have to navigate the anniversary of her death without either of my parents, who were both now deceased. When I got home, I reached out to a friend of mine for a Reiki session. She also performed a spiritual blessing for me, and she pulled 3 oracle cards, a past, a present, and a future. And the future card had a picture of an angel on it. Now, my friend knew about my sister and my sister's death, and she suggested that perhaps this angel card was a sign from the universe that I was meant to reach out to my sister since I was under a little bit of stress about her. So she suggested that I go home and I build a shrine and meditate in an attempt to connect with her. So I did just that. I went home, I gathered some pictures, I built a shrine in honor of my family, my sister, my brother, my children, my parents. I put on one of my favorite CDs, I lit some candles, I turned off the lights, and I sat in meditation. It was the first time I had ever meditated in my life. And within minutes, my sister appeared before me as an angel, and then as a visual, a full sense of her, an image of her. And several minutes later, my parents appeared before me as well. Almost immediately, I was held in the most beautiful and unconditional love. I believe it was God's love. I felt this incredible connection with the universe. I felt a oneness with everything. There were these beautiful, bright, warm, golden lights that were glowing all around me and inside of me. And I dissolved into these lights. I became the light. It was absolutely beautiful. During this time, I became conscious of the music that was playing in the background. And it dawned on me that my family was sending me messages of love telepathically through those song lyrics. And essentially, that message was one of love, to love myself, to love them, they were fine in heaven, to love my family, to love other people, my friends, and to share that love with the world. From October through December, I was numb and dumbfounded and in awe. By this time, I had no idea what had happened to me and what was happening to me. But by this time, I had also experienced my 4th and 5th after-death communications, which were also very numinous and beautiful experiences. January through March, I experienced intense love and happiness. On many days, it felt like a balloon had exploded in my chest, and there was a clamp holding my heart wide open. During this time, I remember reading the book, The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, and I was amazed to learn that he had experienced something similar. In fact, he sat on a park bench for nearly 2 years in total bliss. I began to experience many synchronicities and psychic phenomena. For example, I began finding feathers, many feathers on my nature walks with my dog pictured here. I also began seeing repeated number sequences, such as 911 and 1111. And I continued to receive messages through song lyrics. And interestingly enough, some of those messages that I received came through way of my daughter, who is pictured here, who is a singer-songwriter. On numerous occasions, she had written songs containing lyrics that paralleled circumstances that were happening in both of our lives without her knowing what was happening in my life. We were 500 miles away. She's in college. And there were other telepathic and channeling things that had happened between the two of us, really beautiful things. And I'll share just two quick stories. One story involves our dog, Winifred, pictured here. Several days after my awakening, I received a text message from my cousin, and she had found a puppy for us. And I decided to name the puppy Winifred, after the protagonist in my favorite children's novel, Tuck Everlasting. When I looked up the name Winifred on Google, I was shocked to learn that the name Winifred meant blessed reconciliation, after my blessed reconciliation with my parents and my sister. I couldn't believe it. When I called Abby at college to share the news with her that we were getting a puppy and we were naming her Winifred, she shared with me that on that very day in her college class, she had been given an assignment to give an impromptu speech. And she either had to use the lyrics from a song or a passage from a novel. Now, she's a singer-songwriter, so you would think that she would choose lyrics from one of her songs. She didn't. She chose a book. And guess what book she chose? She chose Tuck Everlasting. And the passage that she referenced was about Winifred. Another story involves the Green Man card pictured here. One night, I went to bed after having watched a tarot reading. The tarot reader had pulled a card of this picture of this Green Man, and explained that the card was symbolic of a rebirth, which made a lot of sense to me because I knew I was going through some kind of a spiritual rebirth. So that night at about 2 a.m., I received a phone call from Abby, long distance from Vermont, crying that she had had this terrifying dream. And we talked for about an hour just to settle her down. The next morning, I shared this picture of the Green Man card with her, thinking that maybe this is what she saw. And sure enough, when she saw it, she said, "Oh my God, Mom, that's it. That's exactly what I saw." Last, the picture of my daughter and Winifred seen here occurred after my 9th ADC, which was a shared one between Abby and I during a meditation where my mom visited with us. And after that meditation, Abby and I talked about it. I then grabbed the camera to get a picture of her and the dog on the couch. And if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, we believe we captured a picture of my mom's hand. And we have several photos of this, sort of looks like this hand reaching out to Abby. 5 months after my spiritual awakening, I was triggered by a couple of events in my life, one of them being the anniversary of my mom's death, who died in 2020 during COVID. We literally had to say goodbye to her over FaceTime because of COVID. Spiraled into a dark night of the soul, and my experience became terrifying. I spent 9 months purging old wounds and trauma. Trauma I didn't even know I had. Now, I knew I was still, that my sister had died 35 years ago, but I didn't really think that I had a whole lot of trauma in my life. So there I am, sort of purging this trauma that I didn't even know I had. And some of the trauma that was coming up wasn't even mine. I didn't know what was going on. I was haunted by memories of the past. I re-experienced my sister's death from 35 years ago, not only from my perspective, but from my brother's perspective and my mom's perspective. And I remember calling my brother saying, I am like purging for you. I'm healing you. Like I'm crying for a lot of your past pain regarding my sister, Lisa. So, and it was weird because I took on like this mediumistic like quality where I felt like I was losing my identity. And I literally began to feel other people's pain. It was frightening, totally frightening. I thought I was going crazy, absolutely crazy. I reached out to my therapist. I reached out to a friend who found a spiritual director and teacher for me. Today, so, hopefully I'm through most of that. I believe that the purpose of the Dark Night of the Soul really, I think, was not only to heal my own personal trauma, but also to heal family trauma as well as intergenerational trauma. So I'm going deeper into that research as we speak, or as I speak. So curious about what was happening, I turned to the literature, and I was astounded to find similarities across the stages of spiritual awakenings, exceptional human experiences, and mystical experiences, the mystic path. In fact, I literally cried when I read this literature because I found that it was paralleling my experience. And up until now, I had no experience about any of this. I'm in the social sciences. I'm in higher ed and teacher education. I didn't know anything about, well, minimally, about transpersonal psychology or spirituality and religion and those kinds of things. So I also discovered that in addition to spiritual awakenings, there are these things called spiritual emergencies. Who knew? And when I went deeper into the research, I thought, oh my gosh, like I totally have spun off into one of these things. And I love this diagram that I have here, pictured here. It sort of captures the difference between a sudden awakening or a spiritual emergency versus a gradual awakening. And you'll see the ascending and the descending lines. It's not a gradual process here. It is, you go up and you come down, and you go up and you go down, and it's almost a psychological nightmare. I began to research deeper into the literature on spiritual emergencies by Groff, and I found that there are 12 or 11 types of spiritual emergencies listed here, and I actually went through 4 of them. In December of 2022, I attended a Chopra retreat with my sister-in-law. Chopra shared this slide on the 7 states of consciousness, and my jaw dropped. He shared that most people only experience the first 3 states in their entire lifetime: waking, dream, and deep sleep state. My theory is I experienced all 4 of the higher states of consciousness, but with complications sort of on the descent, the dark night of the soul, that happened months later. But on the night of my awakening, I know I shot straight up to the top to unity consciousness, experiencing that, and divine consciousness as well, where I believe that I literally sat in the hands of God. I believe all of these experiences can be explained as an evolutionary progression in human development. Maslow spoke of peak experiences and self-actualization as the last stage in the hierarchy of needs. However, months before he died, he experienced a heart attack, which very well may have been a near-death experience. And as a result, he began writing about self-transcendence as the last stage in the hierarchy of needs. Carl Jung has a great quote: "There is no birth of consciousness without pain." He spoke of the collective unconscious. I believe we are meant to integrate the conscious level with the unconscious level to discover our true selves, our authentic selves, and even our spiritual selves. My theory is that spiritual awakenings, a dark night of the soul, and the various types of spiritual emergencies, maybe even some mental illnesses, may very well be this integration process. Ken Wilber speaks of an outward arc and an inward arc of human development. The outward arc of our development is our maturity, growing to maturity over our lifetime up to the top there. You see where it says normality. But we're also meant to experience the inward arc, the return trip home, if you will. And we do this by transcending the normal self to become more spiritual and closer to God or the divine. In conclusion, I believe awakenings are both evolutionary and revolutionary on a personal and collective level. We very well might be in the midst of a spiritual renaissance, a collective awakening, if you will. I also believe awakenings are mental states and they're often very healing mental states. What's unfortunate is often these experiences are pathologized and diagnosed as mental illnesses or mental diseases. I would argue they are not. In fact, awakenings and spirituality in general may very well be biological and innate. There's no coincidence that happening right now in the science community, there is a considerable amount of research. There is research on spirituality and mental health. There is research in the neurosciences and consciousness studies using brain imaging to show where these experiences occur. And there's research on the use of psychedelics for therapeutic and healing purposes. Last, I believe we are meant to share these experiences to help others who might be going through these experiences and to educate the public in general about these experiences. I'm currently writing a book about my experience that will hopefully add to this conversation. Thank you. I would appreciate any comments or questions. You could email me at annabellej@gmail.com, and a shout out to my daughter, Abby BK, who's a singer-songwriter. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ann. That was fascinating. Now we're going to our last speaker for this panel. Her name is Ellen Drummond-Curtis. Ellen is a divinatory dreamer and passionate poet and spirit singer. As chair of the Spirituality Awareness Subcommittee of her county Department of Behavioral Health, Ellen strives to integrate psychology and metaphysics to help all of us embrace our divinity and remember our infinity. She's a tarot and oracle reader, and she was diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder on her 18th birthday. Here I leave you with you, Ellen.
Thank you, Ingrid. So good to be here with you all. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So I'm going to take you back a little over 12 years ago. It was my 18th birthday, as Ingrid said, and I was diagnosed with bipolar 1 with schizoaffective tendencies. And this was also the first time I ever felt that I was having a spiritual awakening. And how apropos, right, for me to have this emergence into adulthood, as well as a spiritual emergency into a cosmic awakening that would change my life forever. And on that day, it was November 10th, 2010, I believed I was pregnant, even though I was sexually a virgin. Now, I had been on a date with a man with whom I'm still friends, and he and I did something very minor, and I felt like it was a snake impregnating me. And it was very sort of Garden of Eden, and I'd never had anything like that happen to me before. I always before considered myself a little bit skeptical, a little bit, like, oh, I'm aware that there's something grand out there that's inside me, but I didn't know to what extent I could take that quote unquote delusion of grandeur. Okay. And now I realized throughout a series of different quote unquote manic episodes that the word delusional, if you break it down, means of like day, loose like light, ion like a process, all like God, pertaining to God, Allah or Elohim or El Shaddai, etc., which are Arabic and Hebrew for God. So delusional, put it all together, means of the light process of God. And this divine spark, as you see on the screen, that led me to this conclusion that love is the home the stars made for us, that we're all connected, and that these experiences that I was having and singing Disney songs all the time and connecting numbers with tarot and oracle cards, speaking of, thank you, Anne, and all these different connections I was making were actually synchronistic. And now Carl Jung, speaking Ingo Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, coined the term synchronicity as we understand. And when he coined that term, it literally just means sin with chron, like time, and icity, meaning like the experiential quality of carrying forth a time and a significant experience in life, like Anne was sharing with her own synchronicities with the card and the dream and the dog and the hand, and like Sean was saying earlier about kind of the white sort of experiential needfulness of that gradient that he showed. And it's so wonderful when I would have all these different experiences of elevation of mood. And when those elevations happened, I realized I did something else with etymology. I like to call myself the ebullient or bubbly etymologist. Manic means pertaining to human mood elevation. Now, these are cards that I drew for myself for my collection of different decks that I own. And I realized that this Merkaba, which is, a term that means the chariot of light, that is our sacred temple body, that when we open our heart, like Lilu in the Fifth Element film with Mila Jovovich and Bruce Willis, that when she opens her heart chakra, she's actually opening up a portal, as I say in this slide, I believe. Yes. When that heart is opening up, you remember that heart and earth are anagrams. They have the same letters. And he, art, the divine qualities of all of us, of the Holy Spirit, the divine spark that resides and resonates within all creation, that when that heart is open, your mind is further enlivened. The Heart Math Institute proved that the heart has a brain, and there's a little nucleus inside the heart that is so activated and that can be studied and examined, and that actually sends pulses to the brain that are stronger than the pulses sent by the brain to the rest of the body. So when the heart has a brain, you experience this deep, profound connectivity to all of life, that mind and heart can come together in wise mind balance, like we say in dialectical behavioral therapy. And yes, as you can probably conclude, with all these many different experiences of manic episodes throughout my life and throughout, this time since I was 18 and now I'm 30, I've had a lot of time in therapy, and I'm thankful for it, because my voice, I think the voice of the divine, I like to say divine is like di is like two, right? And then the vine are the branches of God, Mother, Father, God, and Goddess, right? That there's this beautiful creativity that flows through us when we engage in spiritual and metaphysical and mystical communion. I remember one time I was singing and I was engaging in something so profound. I was just listening to one of my favorite pop songs, and I actually decided, hey, I'm gonna go get some bread and some grape juice that we had in the fridge. And I literally was just like drinking and imbibing and then consuming this bread as kind of a communion with one of my favorite songs. You can literally do that meditatively, creatively, and co-creatively in your life with daily activities to further anoint and bless your experience, to make everything feel like more of a, I like to say, a blissing or blissful, as we saw in the presentation earlier, a blissful and heart-opening experience. So when I have these periods of heightened mood, my voice, I love to sing. I've been in choirs throughout my life since I was in like kindergarten or first grade. My voice is unhinged during manic episodes. So I can sing anything and it's beautiful. And I remember one time I was having an episode and my minister at the time, at the Unity Church, well, I was also going to the Center for Spiritual Living, and they both have hundreds of centers across the globe. She was singing the song that she wrote about the star that fell, which is about Lucifer and the blessing of, this being of light who would fall to help soften and cushion the fall of the divine Adam and Eve. And it was so beautiful to experience that song. And when I was having a manic episode, I was able to harmonize with that song, never having sung it before. And as you'll see in a future slide, I believe that the goddess, one of the reasons, as has been said in other presentations, one of the reasons that we're activated, I like to say DNA is divine nature activation. One of the reasons we're experiencing that is that the mother is being remembered, the cosmic mother. And that is so beautiful. If you look at, this is my pregnant belly when I had my daughter. I actually, hearkening back to what Sean was saying about blockages, that's really interesting because I had multiple tumors during my pregnancy. And it was really fascinating to me later on, after the trauma of it all, looking back in the team, my oncological team, my cancer doctors telling me that these tumors were from when I was a teenager. And of course I had my first episode at 18. So it's kind of like these all culminated and coalesced together. And so my daughter was born on New Year's Day 2014 via vaginal labor induction after a 32-week pregnancy. So she was early, but not too early. And then the following day, I went in to have my first exploratory laparotomy for a tumor that was about the size of a basketball. And there were 2 other tumors after that, and they were neuroendocrine. And I was talking with a woman who's in the band, who was in the band with me at the time at Unity Church, and who was singing that Star That Fell song with me. And she said, Ellen, neuroendocrine, paraganglioma tumors often arise from trauma, from repeated abuse in the home. And my parents, I can't remember a day they didn't fight growing up. There was always something happening with, divisiveness in the home. And I believe that if, of course, with the pregnancy illuminating over the ultrasound that the first tumor was growing, my daughter, Amelia Rose, with whom I used to converse when I was a little girl, she's 9 now. And I remember being a little girl who just wanted to talk with my daughter. And it was so beautiful because it's like her presence in my womb signaled to me and to the doctors, you have cancer, Mom. And so as it says in the slide, my 18-year-old self, I'm tapping into cosmic intelligence. That's one dimension of the goddess. Another dimension of the goddess is the mother. And my daughter, she's all into musical theater. She's into acrobatic dance. There's so many wonderful things that she's doing right now. She's always done. She won an award in preschool for being the most carefree in her class. And I'm just thankful for her that my engagement with her, one of my friends who's a reader, she said, Ellen, your womb was the Holy Grail, which is Mary Magdalene's womb, and the Gnostic and apocryphal texts talk about Mary Magdalene kind of in a very esoteric and motherly way, and that I would provided a Holy Grail carrier for my daughter. And then the day after that, after she was born, with that tumor being removed, that was just, And now I have a 12-inch scar on the abdomen and pelvis, and it just reminds me that I'm thankful that I was able to have the vaginal delivery. And then right after, of course, I accelerated into another quote unquote manic episode. And I had lung failure. So I was singing to be with my daughter, and that helped to strengthen my lungs because she had just been born. And so this is a quote from one of my favorite texts. I'm going to read it. Only when we begin to understand how vast the mother is will we come to understand how powerful she is and how powerful we are. And that's one of the divine awakening traits that we experience, because, you know, when we're having these spiritual emergencies and we know someone who has had something like that happen in their life, it's the awakening to our spiritual gifts. And our spiritual gifts are many and innumerable. And when we tap into that, that could be anything from, you know, you may be a horse whisperer, or you may love science projects, or you may love to, you know, connect with people in a counseling kind of fashion, or you may have something to do with tutoring. Like I was just hired on as a tutor, and you know, virtual remote positionality there. And I'm so thankful, because education is one of the ways in which we can not only be informed but encounter divine wisdom in text that are the scriptures of our lives, that when we know that our heart is a doorway to infinite, untapped intelligence. And, you know, even my mom telling me, Ellen, you know, like, I knew you were having a manic episode that time because you were able to answer all these questions on Jeopardy. And I was getting like a huge chunk of them correct. And it was like, wow. And I remember being in the psych ward one time, and the nurse recognized that I was in that state, and he asked me to name all these capital cities across the globe. And I was just rattling them off, and it was so amazing. And I knew that if I hadn't had the elevation in consciousness, and if I hadn't been defying the depressed mood and going forth into this heart-opening experience that was also mind enlivening and activating, that I probably wouldn't have been able to do all that at the time. So that is so amazing to think about, that we are all these open portals that with the work I do at the Department of Behavioral Health, as was mentioned, thank you, Ingrid, as the chair of the Spirituality Awareness Subcommittee, I see so much that we're all one, right? That we are all these, we are our own oracles. We hold as like you would see, like for example, in the High Priestess card, or in these cards, the Wheel of Fortune, the Sun, and the World. These are all activating portals to the Akashic records, which, you know, that minister I mentioned earlier, who wrote that beautiful song about Lucifer, and Mary Magdalene was called Mary Lucifera, Mary the light bringer, light bearer, when she lived in France, because she was called the woman who knew the all. Reverend Deanna, she actually gave me 2 different Book of Life or Akashic record readings. And one of them, she said, Ellen, you know, like you're one of the elders of the Galactic Council. And I'm like, but that makes so much sense. No wonder I have this proclivity or this tendency to get manic. My senses are heightened, and that's the potential of all of us. Our cells are codes. We have a divine Gaia Codex. One of my favorite books is Gaia Codex by Sarah Drew. It's beautiful. It's on Audible. Shameless plug, not affiliated, but I love that book, because in the piece, you know, the protagonist, Lila Sophia being, you know, the creatrix of the divine spark in all of us, that we see that her DNA is infused with the imaginal cells of butterflies. And when we embrace that transformative quality of all of us to ascend with the Mother and with the Father and with the Divine Daughter and Son, we see that everything is God. At Center for Spiritual Living, we say grand overall design, GOD, or as I like to say also, great open destiny or good operating daily. And it is so beautiful. And this is a quote to close from Ernest Holmes, who about 100 years ago founded the Center for Spiritual Living, the Church of Religious Science, which is the philosophy of Christ consciousness. That's what we practice and that's what we are about. I'm in a treatment and meditation class at this church as well. Ernest Holmes said that. And also, we are all emanations of the divine, and the goddesses rise into balance with the Father. So if you ever think like, why are there so many activations? Why are so many people having these spiritually transformative experiences, like Dr. Yvonne Cason so wittingly and wisely noted in her books, that we're doing this because the balance is being established, just like in Star Wars. It's no accident that the savior in the newer Star Wars movies, Rey, which is, Spanish for king, that it's a woman. Look at, and not saying that men are wonderful too, but there needs to be a harmonization. And that's what I think I experienced when I felt I was pregnant on my 18th birthday, is there was a harmonization in me of the masculine and the feminine that was going to foreshadow my daughter's birth. And Darren and I did conceive on the honeymoon, and exactly a year before she was born, she said, "Mother, I am soon to come." Exactly a year later, after a 7-month pregnancy, didn't know about any tumors, didn't have the marriage yet to Darren. You know what? She said, "I am soon to come," and exactly a year later, on New Year's Day, she was born. So this is a poem that I wrote, and it's a sonnet. It's on one of the tarot cards, and I'm so thankful for all of you. And this is available on my website. Those are some quotes for me. "My true home lies beyond the circumference of my present circumstance." That was the channeled message I received. "You are co-creating your reality." And this is my website, ellensentanglementtheory.com. And if you're so interested, you can follow me on Instagram as well. And you can reach out to me through the website, through the contact me page.
Thank you so much, Ellen. We're now out of time and we're going to questions. Thank you. That was very inspiring. Thank you so much. So now we are going to answer some questions. And for even though the conference have been talking and referring about the spiritual emergencies for the past couple of days, there's some people that don't have the idea clear or don't really know what is this, especially the ones that just joined later. So there's a question from Debbie asking, can someone define a spiritual emergency, please? So who would like to go to this question? Sean?
I can talk about it a little bit, I guess. The term spiritual emergency comes from Dr. Stan Grof, and I think it originally came from a book, The Stormy Search for the Self, where he gave a criteria. And basically what he was saying was that it is a spiritual experience, okay, that obviously can have breakthrough qualities. It could make you a more authentic, open, spontaneous, relaxed person. It can give you, encounters with the divine, like a peak experience. But when it's an emergency, it's something that you really can't handle very well. You have trouble integrating the experience, and it often gets mistaken for acute psychosis in the psychiatric hospital. And so people can feel like they're going crazy when they're in a spiritual emergency, because it just becomes overwhelming for them and brings a lot of difficulty. How's that?
Thank you, Sean. That was
okay.
a good answer. Is
right.
Dr. Ann want to add anything to that?
Yeah, no, Sean, I think that was great. yeah, you're hit with things are coming at you so quickly, like psychic abilities. I felt like I had some clairaudience, some cognizance. A lot of these different psychic openings happened, and I couldn't understand it. I didn't know what synchronicities. I didn't know what all of it meant. And so, yeah, you literally feel like you're going crazy. And the scary thing is, when you reach out to a typical regular therapist, I remember when I reached out to my therapist, when I spun off into the dark night of the soul, I said to her, like, what is this? And I found myself educating her on the stages of the spiritual awakening process, because she had heard of them, but she didn't really know what they were. So, yeah, it's an intensifying, speeding up of the process, if you will.
And Dr. Ann, now that you were sharing with us, there's a question for you that says, did you consider yourself a spiritual person before these experiences started happening to you? Did you ever want them to stop?
I was raised to be spiritual, but I can't say that at this point in my life, I really was on a spiritual path at all. I really think that for me, it was a timing thing. I think I was, again, as I mentioned in my presentation, I was in a very highly reflective time. I had some of these crises in my life. My kids moved away. I was an empty nester. One graduated from college, one graduated from high school. So they were gone. My parents had died. My mom, I lost her during COVID. So I literally sat down to meditate for the very first time, and it happened. So, I embraced it because it was beautiful for the first couple of months. I mean, it was like, just there was no reason for me to reach out to a therapist, because I was just like, wow, this is fabulous, until it went dark, until it went terrifying. So, and then when it went terrifying, I thought, oh my God, like I literally am going nuts. So I need help. And then, like I said, so yes, I mean, I kind of did. I had a beautiful upbringing. I had a religious background, and yeah, so I just think it was this huge healing process for me.
Thank you, Ann. I have a question for Sean. The question is from Julian. It says, can Sean talk about the experience of birth of the Messiah during a spiritual emergency and the energetic, physical sensations that accompany this experience?
Okay, well, I guess there's two different things. The first is the energetic experiences. It tends to follow, the historic information from India, that we've got these hot and cold Kundalini energies that go through us. Okay. And in working with people, what seems to happen, from my experience, it seems like when energies are very hot, it's like trauma is being released through you. And if you don't surrender to that process, if you sort of hold tight, it can become very painful. So you can have sharp pains as you're going through this process. And then from what I've seen, it seems to be a cool energy that comes, particularly when things are sort of settling down. That's been my experience. Not always, but it can be a settling down experience. And sometimes the spiritual experiences are just the sensations of energies, either releasing through the body, releasing from organs, exploding at the heart, something coming at the heart chakra, like somebody might need to say a truth, and then they start choking and choking and choking. That's the energetic heart chakra opening up, So the energies can come in a wide variety of forms, and Yvonne spoke about them already. And they're a big part of what get diagnosed as mental disorders. And the pains associated with those energies are often dismissed as psychosomatic, like by the psychiatrist. They'll say, well, it's all your imagination. This is all in your head. No, people have severe neck pain, or you'll see people with bipolar disorder roll their necks a lot, this kind of thing when they're in an episode. It's because the Kundalini is trying to come through, As far as the Jesus experience, the Messiah experience, I think that in that moment, it's my hypothesis that people are just in touch with the divine part of themselves, and the logical conclusion is that, oh, I'm having I must be the Messiah of some kind. You could also think you're the devil too. That's usually, but the interesting thing about the devil is that those fearful energies tend to get projected. So people can feel more like they're being followed or the devil is after them. It's not as common for people to think that they are the devil, but it does happen.
Thank you, Sean. That was great. Great answer. I
Thanks.
have a comment and a question for Ellen. It says, Ellen, I am a linguistic and I am absolutely delighted with you. That's beautiful. And the
Yes,
question
thank you. I
was,
acknowledge that
Ellen,
in the chat.
mhm.
Go ahead.
Ellen, have you talked to your daughter about your experiences?
Yes, as I said in the comments, I started to say something about like how she helped me when I had, tumors when I was sick. And it was really funny. She heard the word tumor and she was probably 6 or 7 at the time and not necessarily having a frame of reference for that word. She was like, ew, I don't want to talk about that. And so it's very different because I do look at her and I see so much of myself kind of being so open to new experiences, but also a bit concerned about the way our parents are interacting, because I mean she lives with my ex-husband most of the time, and I don't really see her as much as I would like. I see her once a month. And so as I said in the chat, yeah, I did write her a long letter, and as she gets older, she'll be able to understand more, but she's only 9. I don't wanna like go too much into it. But as far as like opening into spiritual concerns, we've started with tarot and oracle cards. So I'm excited. She's already liking it.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ellen. So there's a question from Claudia that says, what happened when you go unconscious after a blow to the head, have a brain injury, and can't remember the event? Who would like to answer this question?
I would just say, I'm not sure I don't know if that's a spiritual emergency or not. I don't know what that is.
So yeah, let's see what else we have here. Well, do you have any comment about that, Sean or Ellen? Let me see what I'll find another question.
The one about blow to the head, which question was it? Can you repeat it?
Like if you had a blow, hit your head and you don't remember anything.
If I may say, like it could be part of your soul contract. I personally believe that that before we're born, we kind of have some experiences that we choose. Like I believe I chose my parents. So there could be a series of life events that you choose to embark upon to help you with your spiritual awakening. So that maybe if you hadn't hit your head, you wouldn't have had the series of events that would have led you down that path.
Thank you, Ellen. That was great. So Darina is asking, how do you see fitting the gap of this obvious need for experienced people who can deal effectively with such and so many different spiritual emergencies?
The $1 million question. It's just it isn't something that's taken hold culturally, to understand these things. And the challenge is, I think it's expensive. It's expensive to do this kind of work, because people need 24-hour support when they go into a spiritual emergency, even if you're working with them in non-ordinary states. My goal is to get in front of insurance companies, because I've had a few clients that are off meds, and they are saving their insurance companies hundreds of thousands of dollars by not being in the hospital every year, by not having their medications paid for month after month. So that's kind of my goal, is to get in front of an insurance company somewhere and say, hey, I'm saving you guys some money. How about paying for my therapy?
And if I may add real quick, so not all of the contributors to the DSM-5, for example, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that psychiatrists use to determine criteria for diagnosis, not all of them agree with the way that the DSM has progressed. So it could be really simple as far as like, not simple, or deceptively simple, I guess. And I like how Sean was saying about getting in front of insurance companies, absolutely, but also showing that the expense of treating clinically people with diagnoses like this, like schizophrenia, bipolar, well, anxiety, all these things of like the societal milieu of what affects us in living in a allegedly free place. It's really quite imprisoning in a lot of ways, that hopefully we can just re-examine the criteria by which we even label people as other, and then of course experience xenophobia, that fear that we feel when we don't understand something, and then that we push them further into psychiatric hospitalization.
Thank you, Ellen. I have another question for Sean. Someone, David says, you mentioned somatic therapies for releasing trauma. What are other effective methods? What's the role of psychedelics?
Okay. Somatic therapies, I just put out there as a very broad term, meaning therapies that get into the intelligence of the body. Personally, I don't think other therapies are particularly powerful, other than, you know, talk therapy can be important. But if you're not doing, to me, if you're not doing some form of the somatic therapy, you're not going to heal your disorder. I personally am not a fan of psychedelics therapy for people who've been through these experiences. The purpose of the psychedelic is to open you up to these experiences. When people have had spiritual transformative experiences, spiritual emergency, or they've got bipolar, they're already open. They don't need another chemical going in there. And to be honest, probably 80% of the people I've talked to were using psychedelics prior to their first episode, or heavy marijuana use. So it's a very complicated place to go. You know, I do think that psychedelics can have a role in dealing with, for example, PTSD and depression. And there's some decent research on that. But even there, I think that the somatic therapies, particularly therapies related to holotropic breath work, would be more helpful. So I'm not on the psychedelics bandwagon. In fact, I never got on that, and I'm staying off.
Now that
Could I respond to that? Could I respond to that?
yes, of course. And
I think it depends. I think it depends on when it's introduced. So, you know, if there are people who have not opened up, I think the psychedelic research is cutting edge right now, because what's happening is people that have PTSD, they are in therapeutic sessions, are giving them psychedelics to induce mystical experiences where they literally begin to heal. And I think that's what these experiences are. They are meant to heal. They are somehow, and it's an evolutionary one. So it's not like you're going to open up and you heal in this lifetime, because I believe if you believe in reincarnation, there are multiple lifetimes. And so I think the end result is for us to get to the divine, the God, eventually, you know, over the course of multiple lives. But I agree with you, Sean, that if you've already opened up, you don't really need the psychedelic experience, right? Because that's what the psychedelic experience has done or is doing for people.
And I'll be honest, I think that there's a little bit of a mentality that, well, we need a psychedelic to have a spiritual experience, you know, and that's just not true. People are not aware of the natural spiritual dimension of their body. They think it's given to them by the pill. It's still like a modern consciousness idea. The pill is giving you this experience, and it's not. The pill just opens you up to what's going on inside you.
no, that was a great answer. Thank you for that. I have another important question here. It says, do you think pharmaceuticals deter the whole emergency and they will keep occurring until you heal?
Do they
So-
deter? Well, does somebody else want to deal with that one, or?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Read it again.
Saying pharmaceuticals deter the whole emergency. I wonder if they just cause more trouble in the process and they will keep occurring until you heal. I imagine it's talking
No.
if
Yeah, I don't know if it's the pharmaceutical, but I do think within a clinical setting, I think psychiatrists and psychologists need to recognize that these experiences are real, and people that are having them are not necessarily they're not it's not a mental disease or it's not a mental illness. So I think if the clinical world would get up to speed on recognizing what they are and helping people through the process. Now, granted, some people might need medication having gone through this kind of experience, but others not so. I mean, I was adamant in my experience, I was not taking medication. I knew I was not crazy, or I knew I had no mental illness. I mean, I knew that literally I sat down one night and I meditated, and this experience happened to me. It came out of the blue. And so when I reached out, I didn't know where to reach out except to a therapist. And I was educating her on what was happening to me. So, I don't know how the pharmaceutical companies come into that, but I do think we need to revolutionize our mental health system to recognize that these are real experiences. And people, if they frame them in terms of spirituality, they need to listen. They need to listen about what they're saying and understand the process of how to get them through that whole process.
thank you so much. Oh,
If I may add really quickly, I am on lithium. Lithium helps me order my thoughts while still embarking on new and creative journey and path working for my spiritual abundance. Like, you know what I mean? So I could still take pharmaceutical drugs like lithium, and I believe you can both, and you can do both. If it's something that helps you, or maybe you take anxiety or depression medication, and if you don't take that medication, you feel the after effects, and then you feel bogged down by some negative self-talk, and then maybe you can eventually work through it without needing the drugs. But maybe if not, that's okay. You don't have to judge yourself. There's a place and a time for all of it.
thank you so much, Ellen. Thank you for this amazing panel. This was just incredible.